This video is brought to you by Ground News. As you might already know, the Hungarian economy has had a turbulent few years. Inflation has been extraordinarily high, real wage growth has been appallingly weak, and while they've since come down a bit, in 2023 the central bank was forced to hike interest rates to a 20-year high. But arguably the most fundamental issue facing the Hungarian economy is the budget. Hungary has run some pretty massive deficits since the pandemic, but things look like they could be about to enter crisis territory. Data published earlier this month, for instance, found that Hungary ran an astonishing 1.7 trillion forint deficit, about 2% of GDP, in February alone, and Germany's decision to essentially scrap the debt brake has triggered a spike in borrowing costs across the continent, which could push Hungary into a sort of debt doom loop, given it already has the highest debt servicing costs in the EU. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at Hungary's economic crisis, why it suddenly got quite a lot worse, and what might happen next. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. The fundamental issue for Hungary's economy at the moment is simply the fact that the government is borrowing unsustainable amounts of money. This really began during the pandemic, when, like much of Europe, Orban started borrowing tons of money to provide fiscal support to affected households and businesses. In 2020, Hungary ran a deficit representing 7.6% of GDP, the largest since 2006. This continued into 2021 and 2022, when the deficit came in at 7.2% and 6.2% of GDP respectively. But this wasn't surprising. The pandemic was still in full swing until late 2021, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 forced many European governments to spend billions protecting households and businesses from the subsequent uptick in energy prices, which is why most European countries were running pretty large deficits. Nonetheless, we should say that Hungary's deficits were still bigger than most, in part because Orban borrowed even more money before the 2022 election for pre-election giveaways. Nonetheless, by 2023, most European countries were normalising their fiscal policy, bringing their deficits back down to pre-pandemic levels, generally around 2 or 3% of GDP. In Hungary, however, this didn't happen. In 2023, Hungary's deficit came in at 6.7% of GDP, the second highest in the EU after Italy's 7.2% deficit. But this was largely because of the controversial superbonus scheme introduced by the Conte government in 2020. This was a slightly bonkers scheme that subsidised 110% of the cost of certain housing renovations, i.e. the government would literally pay you, albeit via tax credits, to renovate your home. Unsurprisingly, the scheme was ruthlessly abused and will ultimately cost the government an estimated €220 billion, 6 times the €35 billion originally forecast, and about 12% of GDP, which is why Italy ran such a massive deficit in 2023. Anyway, the point we're making is that, with the exception of Italy, which was struggling with some pretty unique circumstances, Hungary ran the largest deficit in the EU in 2023, and the fiscal situation barely improved in 2024. Only a couple of months in, the government had to raise its deficit target from 2.9% to 4.5% of GDP, only to then overshoot the revised target, with provisional data suggesting Hungary ran a deficit representing 4.8% of GDP. This is obviously also way above the EU's deficit target of 3%, which is why Hungary is now one of 8 EU member states subject to the bloc's excessive deficit procedure, which threatens fines for fiscal offenders unless they get their budgets in shape. Unfortunately for Orban, things now look like they're getting quite a lot worse. The Finance Ministry set a modest deficit target of 3.7% of GDP for 2025, but this already looks infeasible. Data published earlier this month found that Hungary ran an astonishing 1.7 trillion forint deficit in February alone, which would represent about 2% of GDP. While quite a lot of this was to do with a sudden spike in debt servicing costs that won't be repeated, in other words, a 2% deficit in February doesn't mean that Hungary is on track for a 24% deficit this year. It at least suggests that Hungary is now very unlikely to hit this new 3.7% target. On top of this, Hungary has already revised its deficit forecast for 2026 up from 2.9% to 3.5% of GDP, after Orban announced billions of euros worth of tax breaks to mothers and pensioners to be phased in ahead of the 2026 election. Splurging all this cash has also pushed up inflation, which rose to a recent high of 5.6% in February. This has also forced the Hungarian central bank to pause cutting interest rates, which have now been held at 6.5% since September, the joint highest in the EU along with Romania. High interest rates have made it even more expensive for the Hungarian government to borrow, because ordinary Hungarians are now happy to just store their cash in an interest-bearing deposit rather than invest them into Hungarian bonds. This is one of the reasons that Hungary had quite literally the highest borrowing costs in the EU last year, paying an average annual interest rate of 6.5% on its debt, roughly double the EU average. This means Hungary now spends an inordinate amount of money just servicing its debt, i.e. paying off the interest on its pre-existing debt pile. In 2023, Hungary spent more than 4% of GDP servicing its debt, the highest in the EU and about double the Central European average. This figure will probably continue to rise if Hungary's borrowing costs remain elevated, and this makes the recent increase in European bond yields especially worrying for Orban and co. For context, European bond yields, i.e. how much interest European governments have to pay on their debt, went up across the continent a couple of weeks ago, after Germany announced a massive increase in borrowing to fund investments in public infrastructure and defence spending. The reasons for this are slightly complicated. But the basic idea is that, if Germany issues a whole load of debt, investors will choose to buy that German debt instead of other European debt, which means less demand for other European debt and therefore higher borrowing costs across the entire continent. Anyway, Hungary was no exception in this respect, and Hungarian bond yields are now the highest they've been since late 2023, which makes servicing Hungary's debt pile even more expensive. The risk for Hungary here is that it gets stuck in a sort of debt doom loop, where it needs to borrow more money to service its debts, which increases servicing costs, which means more borrowing, etc. The massive 1.7 trillion forint deficit Hungary saw in February, which, as we mentioned earlier, was largely a consequence of a sudden spike in servicing costs, suggests Hungary could be on the precipice of exactly this sort of thing. On a related note, this story about the EU's new joint borrowing plans, in part a reaction to the fiscal woes of member states, has been covered by more than 352 sources. Interestingly, we know that 42 of them have been reported by the left and 49 of them have been reported by the right. That's because this week's sponsor, Ground News, are experts on pulling back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, they ingest over 50,000 articles from all over the world and then organise each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lead on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in left-leaning and right-leaning reporting. For example, for this story, left-leaning outlets tended to focus on how it'll help Europe support Ukraine, while right-leaning outlets tended to focus on whether more Eurosceptic member states, like Hungary, could get in the way. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.